name is Cynthia Jones, and I am here in Spokane, Washington at the Ninth Circuit Judicial Conference in 2019. And here with us is Judge Robert Lasnik of the Western District of Washington.
Good morning, Cynthia. So nice to have you asking me questions.
Thank you. Well, let's just dive right in and ask you, what was your decision along the way that wanted you to be a lawyer, that you wanted to be a lawyer?
Well, if you look back at my high school yearbook, which I do probably more than most people, just to see how young I looked, but my ambitions down there were lawyer, psychiatrist. So I've always had interest in both the law and psychology or psychiatry, and also journalism. I was sports editor of the newspaper in my high school. I worked for my hometown newspaper. I have a master's in journalism. I have a master's in counseling psychology. I have a law degree. So I've always been interested in looking for combinations of fields, and that's how I always viewed whatever I end up doing. It's going to have a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and a little bit of this.
Got it. So talk to us about some of your early influences.
Definitely TV shows, Perry Mason, the Defenders with E.G. Marshall, that was a great one. To Kill a Mockingbird, both the book and the Gregory Peck movie. But I also would read 4 or 5 newspapers every day. My father would bring home the New York Daily News and the New York Times, and we would get the Staten Island Advance, and my mother would bring the World Telegram home from her job, and I would just devour the newspapers. So those were always major interests for me, that this is fun, to be a journalist, to be a lawyer, to be a psychologist. I thought it's real people jobs.
Sure. So a lot of your influences seem to come from the perspective of a public defense lawyer, yet you, before becoming a judge, were in the prosecutor's office. How did that come about?
Well, that's a good observation. When I was at law school at University of Washington in the late 70s, we had a young law professor named Wallace Lowe, who is now the president of the University of Maryland, and he's an amazing academic and wonderful person. And he started a criminal justice practicum at the law school. In those days, the law school was totally opposed to any clinical program or practicum, but they decided, to let Wallace have a 2-year attempt at this criminal justice program. And I think there were 4 or 5 of us out of 15 who ended up becoming judges eventually, including Laura Inveen, Bill Downing, Dave Kurtz up in Snohomish County. But it was taught by a person from the public defender's office and a person from the prosecutor's office. And the person from the prosecutor's office was Jay Rich. And Jay Rich made the point to me and to Bill Downing that you guys have tremendous interest in public defense, and that's wonderful. We need public defenders. But when you're a defense attorney, you're handling one case. When you're a prosecutor and you can make a system fairer, you're influencing thousands of cases. And Jay had that approach of, let's make the systems fairer. Not as prosecutors, we have a special obligation to treat people fairly and with just results. And that appealed to my background very strongly. And so I decided after the second year of law school to apply for an internship with King County Prosecutor's Office. Bill and I got them. We were sent out to district courts and trying cases. And at that point, the change was made, and we were both prosecutors. And I never looked back with any regret, because I worked not just on prosecuting cases, but I worked in the legislature on passing sentencing reform, victim rights. I got to be involved in making the system more accessible to child victims and victims of sexual assault. So what Jay promised was a possibility became a reality in the King County Prosecutor's Office for me.
Thank you. I also noticed that you were chief of staff for Norm Mailing, the prosecutor for the city of Seattle.
For King County.
For King County. And Norm is not with us anymore, but he, for those of the viewers watching that are not from Washington State, he was quite a figure. And I wonder if you might talk a little bit about how his philosophy in the office influenced you, and then further maybe becoming a judge and your views there on the bench.
Yeah, Norm was an incredible influence in my life. He was, all you need to know about him is the ABA Professionalism Award is named the Norm Mailing Award, and that's a national thing. He was revered by everyone who he came in contact with. He was by label a Republican, but anyone who interacted with Norm just knew that he was a kind, sweet, honest, intelligent man who was very committed to the idea that the prosecutor's office had a lot of power and it had to be used in a very measured way, that just charging somebody with a crime can ruin their lives. So we have to be very careful what we do. And he instituted, an open file policy that anyone can come in and look at our files. That's not the way it happens in the United States Attorney's Office, I can assure you, and in most prosecutors' offices in the country. He encouraged us that, our goal is to see that justice is done, not just to get convictions. And Norm would be so thoughtful in so many ways. And he was a very old-fashioned person in a lot of ways. He had the Washington Post sent to him to read by the mail, even though it arrived 3 days late. We had these kind of Norm mailingisms. One of them was, don't write it down on a piece of paper unless you expect it to be on the front page of the Seattle Times the next day. And boy, that was before emails. And Norm gave me incredible opportunities at a very young age. He saw something in me that he wanted to have around him. So in 1981, this is less than 3 years out of law school, I am hired to replace Marilyn Showalter, who had been the policy person because she was taken by our last Republican governor, John Spellman, to be his legal counsel. So Norm interviewed me one day. It was a Sunday, and I went into the office to meet with him. And after we talked for a while, he said, well, Bob, this morning I cleaned my garage, and I didn't think anything could be better than that, but meeting you was. I didn't know Norm well enough to know whether he was being sarcastic or he was the person who actually liked cleaning his garage. I later found out that was a compliment because he really loved cleaning his garage. And the fact that I exceeded that was a good thing. But once again, it was influence of Jay Rich and Dave Berner, the chief criminal deputy, and Mary Kay Barbieri and Becky Rowe, who I had worked with in special assault, who went to Norm and said, you should interview Bob Lasnik. He's somebody who you're going to want to have with you. And so I went to Olympia. Norm and I used to drive there a couple of times a week for sentencing reform. And in those days, you didn't have cell phones.
Right.
That's an hour and 10 minutes each way to just talk about life. And we became really, really close. And then he asked me to be his chief of staff at a very young age again. I was also, Bill Downing and I did the Wami massacre murder cases. Again, less than 5 years out of law school. I will never forget the day that the chief of police for the city of Seattle and the Wami task force came over to the prosecutor's office where Norm was going to tell them who was going to try these capital cases. And this is the largest robbery-related mass murder in the history of the United States. It was then, and it still is now. 13 people killed in a Chinese gambling club in the International District. We've had larger mass murders, but not robbery-related the way this one was. And so when Norm introduced Bill Downing, 34, and Bob Lasnik, 32 and 33, something like that, less than 5 years out of law school, and had I had not tried a murder case. Bill had tried a couple, but we were not the veteran prosecutors that you would have thought Norm would give the case to. And I remember Pat Fitzsimons looking at us and looking at Norm and looking back at us and saying, Norm, I sure hope you know what you're doing. And by the end of that case, Pat Fitzsimons we were like his adopted sons. He had so much respect for the way we handled the case. And we knew that there was a lot on the line, including Norm's reputation if we messed up that case. And we did a pretty nice job on that case.
What do you think it was about you that Norm saw where he would place his trust in such a young litigator?
I wish we could ask Norm that question. And, he did die very suddenly in 2007. But I think what Norm saw in me was a version of himself, but sort of East Coast Jewish version. He was the Norwegian farm boy from Acme, Washington, but somebody who had a real striving to learn things. He loved the way I used words, and I wrote many speeches for Norm. Some policy ones and even some political ones when he ran for higher office and always lost. He was a wonderful office holder. He was a terrible candidate. But that's a very good question, Cynthia. I'm not exactly sure what it was, but yeah.
So you've talked about the Wami massacre, which was a fairly large and public case. There's another very important public case that you were involved in, and I wondered if you would talk a little bit about the Chuck Goldmark case.
Yeah, the Wami was interesting because Bill and I were so wrapped up in doing the case right and not really wrapped up in identifying with the victims. They were, for the most part, Chinese immigrants who were restaurant owners, who were in their 60s, maybe late 50s. They would close up the restaurant and go to the gambling club with all their cash. And we knew it was a horrible tragedy, but we didn't identify with the victims as much as we should have, frankly. We had a distance. In the Goldmark case, it's a Seattle lawyer, like us, in his home, like us, with his children, and both Bill and I had children then, and the entire family wiped out in one awful, awful evening on Christmas Eve because the criminal who did it thought that Chuck Goldmark was the top communist in the state of Washington. And he had conflated Chuck's dad, John Goldmark, who had been a state legislator in the 50s and was accused by a newspaper of being a communist, with the son, Chuck Goldmark, who no one ever had associated with communism or anything like that. It's an example of how hate speech can lead to horrible incidents even before the internet. These people were sending things through the mail to each other about the communist Chinese are poised on the southern border and the North Vietnamese and the Russians are on the northern border and they're going to invade any minute. And they have all these communist operatives throughout the country who are going to help them. And this man who went to some place called the Duck Club in Seattle, where right-wing people talked about these things, heard the name Goldmark, got it in his head that this attorney, Chuck Goldmark, was the communist, and bluffed his way into the home and killed those people. Now, Bill and I had a case that wrenched our hearts. And it was a lesson about, we should have had the same reaction in the Wami case, but we were too young and too removed from it. But the Goldmark case, that was no fun. It was a really, really hard thing for us. It was an insanity defense. We got a conviction and we got the death penalty. It was later reversed by one of my colleagues on the federal court, Judge Jack Tanner, for ineffective assistance of counsel. But Rice pled guilty to a non-capital aggravated murder, and he will die in prison for sure eventually.
So how did working on these kinds of cases inform your judicial philosophy later?
I don't think that it did that much.
Okay.
I think those were kind of one-offs. When I had my first capital habeas case out of Kitsap County, I was looking at it much more in the line of when cases would come into the prosecutor's office, how did Norm make his decisions about whether to seek the death penalty or not, and the thought that he put into that. And when you see a case where the prosecutor didn't use the thought and didn't use the judgment, you are affected by that. But those crimes were so extreme that they really didn't have any impact on my judicial philosophy. My judicial philosophy was much more along the lines of what I talked about earlier. Treat people with respect and fairness, work towards a just result. When you're in the courtroom, try to make it more accessible to everyone. I use humor quite a bit, which, when I became a judge, somebody told me two things, Bob. Never use humor from the bench. It doesn't work, don't do it. And two, be yourself. And I said, well, I can't be myself and not use humor, so I've continued to do it. And I've always had jurors say to me, especially in a jury trial, it relaxed us so much when you told some jokes. Not at anyone's expense, but just, lighten up the tone a little bit in the courtroom, that they were able to concentrate and do their jobs better. So I've never had anyone complain about the jokes. And actually, when I went for my interview with the bipartisan merit selection panel to become a federal judge, the very first question I got, and it's an intimidating group of people there, very first question I got was, why do you want to be a federal judge? And my answer was, well, when I became a state court judge, I had this big bump up in how people reacted to my jokes, but it's kind of leveled off. And I think as a federal judge, I'll get another bump up where people will find me even funnier. And again, it wasn't that was the best joke in the world, but it told people this guy's not going to have federal judge-itis. And the fact that he felt comfortable saying that is much better than somebody saying, well, hopefully I'll be on the United States Supreme Court someday, and so this is launching my federal judicial career, or, I think I'm the savior of the Constitution, or, anything like that. So I use humor in that way because it's part of who I am.
Right. So let's back up a little bit. You went to law school, came out, worked for Norm Mailing, and somewhere between there and the federal bench, there were some other stops along the way. You want to talk to us a little bit about your trajectory?
Well, really it was, Norm ran for governor in 1988, didn't make it, but got to know the governor, Booth Gardner, pretty well. And Booth said to Norm, if you have any people you think would be good state court judges, just call me. And so he called about Bill Downing in middle of '89, and he called about Bob Lasnik a couple of months later. And so I went directly to the state court bench from the prosecutor's office. I had interviewed with some of the big law firms, but it really wasn't what I wanted to do. I wanted to become a judge, and I thought the training that I had was good for that. Now, Norm and his wife Judy had suffered a terrible tragedy in February of 1989, where their wonderful, beautiful, intelligent young daughter Karen died in a sledding accident in Magnolia, where she went down the hill, couldn't stop, and went right into a parked car with a devastating head injury and passed away later that night. Mike McKay, later U.S. Attorney, and I were the two people at the hospital with the Mailing family that night to talk to the media and handle things. And Norm was absolutely devastated, and it was hard for him to just get back to work. And the thought of me leaving him at that time was really hard. And I'll never stop being grateful to Norm for the fact that he wasn't selfish. He was like, no, Bob, you want to do this, you go. I'll be okay. But I felt very torn about that because I knew it was going to be a devastating loss for Norm personally to have me leave at a time when I was doing more and more things in the office that he just couldn't handle. But that was so emblematic about Norm. He was always looking to promote people's lives and careers. And as I say, he ran for higher office a couple of times and didn't win. And when I did the eulogy at Norm's funeral in 2007, I compared him to Banquo in Macbeth. That the witches told Banquo, "You will never be king, but your children and your children's children will be king." And that's the situation with Norm. Rick Martinez, Richard Jones, Marcia Peckman, Bob Lasnik, Jay Rich. There's so many people who became, in their own way, federal judges, state court judges, state Supreme Court, Mary Yu, Steve Gonzalez. These people, Steve actually was federal, but state court. But Norm had an impact in so many people in placing them in business, in law firms, in the judiciary, that I felt that we were all an extension of where we started in that sense. So, I mean, you look back at my background, I went to the state court bench. I had never tried a civil case in my life. I'd only tried criminal cases. But it didn't take long to see that if you just read the material and you actually looked at a couple of cases, the civil bar was like, oh, this guy's going to be great. And in those days, we did a master calendar for summary judgment and civil motions. So you'd have lawyers in there to watch, waiting for their case. And lawyers can be a lot more objective when they're watching somebody else's case and seeing that, wow, the judge is asking good questions, he's read the cases, he's read the briefs. And the reputation, Seattle community is still small enough that people could say, even though Downing and Lasnik have never tried civil cases, they're ready to try civil cases. Don't worry about that. And it just worked out that way.
Do you recall the first day you sat on the bench as a judge?
In Superior Court?
Mm-hmm.
I remember the first motion, it was like a motion to suppress. My J.A. Terry Roberts, who's still with me, was my bailiff back then. Wow. This is 1990.
Wow.
And somebody was on the witness stand, and I wrote a note and passed it to her that said, "Liar, liar, pants on fire." And I could not believe that I had done that. And of course, I'm up there like looking very serious with a poker face, and you know, she's can't help breaking up. But that's what I remember about my first day.
How does that compare with your first day as a federal judge?
You know, I can't even say I remember my first
Really?
day as federal judge. It probably took a couple of weeks to actually get into the courtroom. Whereas in state court, you were in on day one and you never left.
Right.
But you know, it's a different. I remember thinking how fortunate I was to get the federal judgeship, and that this was an amazing place to be. And I was joining this bench of people who I had always looked up to and admired, some of whom had been Superior Court judges. I took Carolyn Dimmick's position on the federal bench. One of my very first trials, it was in front of her when she was a Superior Court judge in the 1970s. And so Barbara Rothstein, my very first jury trial as a prosecutor was in front of Judge Rothstein. And so these were people who I really had on a pedestal, and to join them as the kid was really a lot of fun.
Mm-hmm. Once you were underway and well established as a federal judge, you're known for quoting Bob Dylan. Can you talk to us a little bit about that influence?
Yeah, you know, Dylan has always been somebody who, to me, was emblematic of our era of protest, of attempts to make the world a better place through fairness and justice, and times they are changing. You know, we had that millennials yesterday. You know, the baby boomers were, if a rule doesn't make sense, I don't have to obey it. Mm-hmm. And there was an aspect of Dylan as a rebel, Dylan as a folk singer, Dylan as a protest song singer that really appealed to me when I was growing up in New York. And I wasn't like I was looking to quote Dylan all the time, but sometimes those Dylan quotes, which are in my head were just the right thing to say at the right time. And so that's kind of how it got in there. I didn't set out to do it, but then when the LA Times did the article, about judges who quote Dylan, then it sort of labeled me. You're the Dylan
It all
guy.
cemented.
Yeah, and then I did the Avo case, which also seems quaint now, but AVVO, the lawyer
Yeah.
rating website, and 2 lawyers in Seattle objected to their ratings and sued Avo to say that they were not accurate and not based on sufficient research, et cetera, et cetera. And I said, come on, people, get over it. Everyone gets rated these days. And this was 10 years ago. And I said in a footnote that I myself had been talked about as one of the top judges in American Law Dragon magazine, which probably lasted about 3 months. And what it said about me was, Seattle's Judicial Star dispenses contraceptives while saving orcas and quoting Bob Dylan. And I said, what can you say about such nonsense? All you can say is what my mother used to say to me when I grew up in Staten Island. I would regale her with one of my wonderful exploits, and she would say, Bobby, that and 5 cents will get you a ride on the Staten Island ferry. And so for John Henry Brown, the answer to your thing is that and $1.75 will get you a ride on the South Lake Union trolley. But no, you're not going to win this case. So
Right.
there's another thing where you just make fun of that. We all take ourselves way too seriously.
Right. So looking back over your judicial career in the Western District of Washington, any memorable cases that stand out to you?
Yeah, I think, it's true. I had the case with the orcas where I said that they needed to be an endangered species category and that the government had messed it up. But, I also, and then I had the Erickson versus Bartell in 2000 was a really interesting case. And I'm telling you, this case would not be, would not have the same patina today that it did then. It was a case where a woman who was a pharmacist at Bartell's was suing Bartell's for not covering her contraceptives under their health plan, that they were providing their employees with a health plan that did not pay for women's contraceptives, although it paid for Viagra for men. And the interest groups on that side had recruited Jennifer Erickson because she was married, she was a pharmacist. She talked about how women would come with their prescription and she had to tell them that it wasn't covered by their insurance and they had to decide whether to use the contraceptives or feed their family. And so it was a really interesting case of first impression on whether Title VII and the protection for gender equality would cover this. And that's where I did my quote from Dylan about the times they are changing, to put the 1964 Civil Rights Bill in perspective about what were the issues at the time. And women were added to that bill almost as a way to try to kill the bill by legislators who opposed it, because it was like funny, you're going to protect people by race, why don't you protect them by gender too, ha ha. But it stuck in there. And the argument was really interesting because the people at Bartell's, and it's a family-owned, long-time business in Seattle, they were not trying to discriminate against women. I think they felt really, really bad about the situation. And, I ruled in favor of Ms. Erickson and the interest groups that it was covered and it had to be provided. And Bartell's didn't even appeal. They said, we had no idea, now we know, we're happy to do it. nobody ever brought up the religious aspect. We don't believe in contraceptive, and we don't believe in this, and it would have taken on a whole different tone, I'm afraid. But that was a big case. But the biggest case for me is Wilbur versus Mount Vernon. And it's a very interesting case because it was brought by the ACLU against the couple of cities up in the Skagit County area, Burlington and Mount Vernon, for failing to provide a meaningful public defense system. They hired 2 private lawyers to handle all the public defense work, but their caseloads were like 800, 750 per lawyer, and they had private practices that they were doing on the side. And when I first looked at that case, I thought, there's no way I'm going to order those cities to spend more money on public defense. You know, just not going to happen. But the presentation of the case by Toby Marshall primarily and James Williams was so well done. And by the time the case was over, I became the first federal judge in the United States to find a Sixth Amendment violation for providing inadequate public defense. And there too, to their credit, the cities did not appeal. They basically said, we didn't realize what was going on, and we're embarrassed what we saw. And I appointed Eileen Farley, former defender, to be my monitor up there to make sure things were done right. And she would report back on a regular basis about how cooperative the city, the executive and the legislative branch were to get more money. They brought in new lawyers. They did a really great job. It was very interesting. The one part of the government that resisted change was the judiciary. The municipal court judges were not happy with what I did, and they thought I was accusing them of violating the Constitution, and they were very, very resistant. They didn't see what was going on. Most of these things were happening. There was a just meet 'em and plead 'em system, literally. And they were getting really great deals because the city attorney, who was also totally overworked, was just giving away the farm. But that's not a Sixth Amendment right. You know, ineffective assistance of counsel by a prosecutor, that's not my problem, but ineffective assistance of counsel. And by that I mean, some of these people actually had defenses, and they were not given a chance to plead not guilty and go to trial, because you're going to stay in custody. And some of them were facing deportation if they pled to a particular crime, and they weren't told about that. So that's the case where I think it's had ramifications, not just within the state of Washington, but throughout the country, to say that it has to be meaningful public defense. It just can't be somebody who's sitting there saying, I got you a great deal now, sign this. And
So across your career, there came a point where you decided to take senior status.
But we've missed a lot in there.
Well, so tell me.
Yeah. See, you talked about me being Norm Malling's chief of staff.
Yes.
I love that role of being a policy person and an administrative person. I had the 7 years as chief judge where I could do that in the district. And I was blessed to be asked, excuse me, to go on the National Budget Committee and work with Julia Gibbons and meet judges from all over the country and be really involved in the judiciary's budget. And then asked to go, I was elected at one of these to be the district judge representative following Chuck Breyer, and got to be on the Judicial Conference US, which is the policy-making body for the federal courts. And then asked by Chief Justice Roberts to be on the executive committee, which is really the apex of the federal judiciary. So now I'm in my element. I love what I do in the courtroom, but if that's all I did, I'd go crazy. I have always had to have something else to supplement. In state court, I was chair of the bench bar press, and now I have a chance to be with Merrick Garland and some of the really, Sarah Vance from New Orleans, some of the really great federal judges, setting policy for the federal judiciary. So
Talk
now
to us
I'm
a
in
little
heaven.
bit, yeah, how that committee works for those that aren't judges and viewing this and looking
Yeah.
at Judge Lasnik.
You know, we have the third branch governance is like a secret, right? Like it's almost like you have to know the handshake to get in. We have these committees that don't meet in public, that do reports that go to the judicial conference, and the judicial conference does not meet in public. It meets in the Supreme Court in a room. Nobody's allowed in from the media or from the public. And then the judicial conference meeting itself is almost like a kabuki theater of something that's been put together prior to that by the executive committee. So the executive committee has issues that bubble up to its level. It decides which ones we should put on the discussion calendar and which ones we shouldn't. Any member of the conference can try to move something to the discussion calendar, even if we didn't want it. But you get a lot of dirty looks from the Chief Justice if you do that. And, you know, so it's really kind of like a star chamber thing. But it's some of the best and brightest of the federal judiciary trying to deal with issues of governance. Now, we don't deal with like cameras in the courtroom or some of those kind of policy issues. It's much more along the lines of, you know, budget and legislative liaison and how do we handle this and that. And
What is it about it that makes you feel you're in your element when you're there?
well, because I get to use not just my legal reasoning skills, but I get to use my strategic thinking, my written communication skills, and my oral communication skills. And that's always been the best thing. I mean, as a judge, you have to be kind of a neutral, detached person. But when you're sitting on the executive committee, you get to be an advocate for positions. You get to argue with other talented people about should we do this or should we do that. We would meet twice a year with the Attorney General of the United States. I mean, that's pretty heady stuff.
Yeah.
And you know, and then you meet with the Chief Justice, and it's pretty awesome.
Are you able to talk about any of the issues that you're grappling with, or is it confidential?
If I told you, I'd have to kill you. Cynthia. Yeah.
Fair enough.
No, I mean, I'm not on the executive committee anymore. I've rotated off.
Yeah.
But Sid Thomas is on now.
Yes.
And I'm sure he'll tell you everything that's going on. Yeah. But Merrick Garland is the new chair of the executive committee. So, you know, for me, if I had a choice between being on the Supreme Court or being chair of the executive committee, I'd take the Supreme Court. But it was a consolation prize for Judge Garland, and he would have been a fabulous Supreme Court justice. Really, really sad that he didn't make it there. But
Yeah. Anything else that we've missed between your judicial career and your decision to go senior status? Because I do want to talk about that a little bit, but I want to make sure we're encapsulating all of the in-between time.
Well, let me tell you a story of my education that I think really explains who I am. I had a psychology professor at Brandeis, my undergraduate, who told a story about a author, Paul Tillich. He was an ethicist philosopher, and he wrote a book called Love, Power, and Justice. And this professor said Mr. Tillich once spoke to a room full of people at the apex of their career in law, in philosophy, and religion. And he asked them, what do you think is the most important word in the title of my book? And about a third of the people took love. Said, you know, love is what really brings change, and you bring passion to it. And another third said, yeah, but without power, you really can't make changes. And another third said, no, it's justice. Justice does the leavening between love and power, and you always have to keep your eye on that. It's really justice. And Tillich said, well, you're all wrong. The most important word is and. And that really resonated with me, that look for the and in things and try to find the and. So you can be a judge and you can be this. You can be a journalist and you can be that. You can be a prosecutor and you can do this. Life is not about black and white. It's about grays, and it's about finding ways to incorporate things. Mm-hmm. So the decision to go senior, I'm not going to bore people with the rule of 80, but I did it as soon as I could for one reason, and one reason only. I was hoping President Obama would have a chance to replace me. Mm-hmm. And it was January of 2016, and a wonderful judge was nominated to replace me, Beth Andrus, but she never got a hearing. And then after the 2016 election, it is what it is. You can't undo it. So,
and it's still vacant.
3.5 years and counting, mm-hmm. and it might be another 3.5 years for all we know. Mm-hmm. But without our senior judges, we would be in really, really terrible shape. And frankly, I think the bars up in Seattle and King County and in Western District of Washington has not done enough to emphasize with the political leaders that this is a crisis in our community, and that things need to happen. And I think the bar is saying, well, we like Judge Lasnik, we like Judge Peckman, we like Judge Robart, we like Judge Settle. The fact that they're not replaced, that's not a bad thing. We'd rather have the judges we know than judges we don't know. But I think at some point, because our spouses are telling us, hey, we'd like to really have some time to travel and do things together. You've worked so hard. 30 years in the judiciary isn't that enough? And the bar is going to see that they're not going to get their civil cases to trial in 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. Mm-hmm. And then maybe they'll sit up and take notice, but they should have taken notice by now. So it's been a disappointment for us.
And then I'd like to know, how would you like to be remembered?
I had a case with Sir Mix-a-Lot a couple of years ago where somebody was suing Mix for saying that he did the scratches on Baby Got Back on the keyboard, and therefore he should get half the royalties of 20 years of sales of Baby Got Back. And Mix-a-Lot was in my courtroom with his attorney, Judy Endian, and I ruled in favor of Sir Mix-a-Lot, and I talked a lot about music and creativity and this and that. And I saw Ms. Endian a couple of months later and said, boy, that was an interesting case, and she said, yeah, when you were making your oral ruling, Mix-a-Lot leaned over and said to me, the dude gets it. So that's how I'd like to be remembered. The dude got it. Somebody who was hip to the culture and changes, who understood complicated issues in the courtroom, who could relate to people, who exposed himself to the public to say, look at what we do. We're proud of what we do. I wish we had cameras in the courtroom. The more people who see what we do, the better. But the dude got it.